All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today we're diving deep into the history of conflict in Ukraine.
A fascinating and sadly relevant topic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're going to be focusing on an article from History.com called Ukraine Has Seen Centuries of Conflict.
Yeah, it's a great resource to sort of unpack why this nation has become such a focal point, well, for conflict, really for centuries.
Exactly, and I think listeners will be surprised to learn that it's a far more intricate story than just the recent headlines.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
To truly grasp what's happening today, we need to understand this, well, this really complex past.
So let's rewind the clock way back. Way back. The article starts with this kind of wild fact. Modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia all share roots in this medieval kingdom called Kievan Rus.
Right. Founded by, get this, Vikings in the 9th century.
Vikings in Eastern Europe. Seriously.
And by 1037, it was the largest kingdom in Europe. Yeah, think about that. The St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, that's a legacy of that period. This shared heritage is actually something that both Ukraine and Russia kind of claim as their own, which adds another layer to their complicated relationship, to say the least.
Okay, so we've got Vikings setting up shop, building this massive kingdom. What happened? How did things start to unravel?
Well, like a lot of big, powerful kingdoms, Kievan Rus had pressure from both inside and out. But the Mongol invasion in 1240, that was the real turning point. Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, leading this massive army, just swept across Europe, ultimately captured Kiev.
Wow.
Yeah, it created this power vacuum, and that opened the door for Lithuania and Poland, and they start to, exert their own influence over Ukrainian lands.
So external forces changing the map. But what about within Ukraine? Were there any groups, vying for power during this time?
Absolutely. In the 1600s, you have the Cossacks.
The Cossacks.
These fierce warriors, they rebelled against Polish-Lithuanian rule, actually carved out their own little, well, semi-autonomous state called the Hetmanate.
So they had a taste of self-rule, which I imagine must have fueled their desire for full independence.
For sure. But here's the thing. They were already pushing back against Poland-Lithuania. So why then, in 1654, did they decide to ally with Russia?
It seems counterintuitive.
It's complicated. The Cossacks saw Russia as a potential ally, right, against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They wanted protection, support. But in the end, this alliance, well, it really backfired. Led to this awful period called the Ruin, decades of conflict. And instead of getting security, Ukraine ended up divided between Russia and Poland-Lithuania.
So this ruin was a direct result of this Cossack alliance with Russia. That's a pretty big turning point.
Huge turning point. The Ruin, it refers to all these wars, internal conflicts that just ripped through Ukrainian lands for decades, decimated the population, crushed the economy, and it just solidified that division of Ukrainian territory. And honestly, you can trace so many of the tensions we see today, these struggles over control of the region, right back to that division.
Devastating. And I'm guessing Russia wasn't just sitting back watching this all happen.
Oh, no, not at all. The Battle of Poltava in 1708, that really cemented Russia's dominance. Peter the Great, he defeats Sweden, and that victory gives Russia control over eastern Ukraine. And really, it marks the beginning of, the Russian Empire's rise.
And with the rise of the Russian Empire, what happens to Ukrainian identity? Did it just get absorbed into this new power structure?
Well, that's exactly what Russia wanted. And Catherine the Great, she played a major role in this. 1783, she annexes Crimea.
Crimea.
Super strategic move. Gave Russia access to the Black Sea.
Right, so Crimea's strategic importance goes way back.
Yeah.
But this wasn't just a land grab, was it? Catherine also went after Ukrainian culture, the language, right?
Oh, absolutely. She wanted to fully integrate Ukraine into the Russian Empire, not just geographically, but culturally, too. So she dissolved the Cossack Hetmanate, and she put all these policies in place to basically Russify Ukraine.
Russify, so suppressing the Ukrainian language, promoting Russian culture, limiting any kind of Ukrainian autonomy.
Exactly, trying to wipe out their identity, make them part of Russia. But did Ukrainians just accept this?
I have a feeling they didn't go down without a fight.
You're right, they didn't. Despite the oppression, that spirit of Ukrainian identity, it persisted. In the 1800s, a Ukrainian nationalist movement starts to emerge, driven by this desire to hold on to their language, their cultural heritage.
It seems like no matter how much pressure was applied, they just refused to disappear. This nationalist movement, how did they push back against Russification?
Their focus was on solidifying a distinct Ukrainian identity, right? They codify the Ukrainian language, they promote Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian art, and they really reassert their history as separate from Russia. It was a direct challenge to the Russian Empire's narrative.
So we've got this rising sense of Ukrainian national identity clashing with Russia's attempts to control and assimilate them. Sounds like, well, a recipe for conflict.
Oh, yeah. And as we head into the 20th century, that conflict is only going to intensify, leading to some of the most tumultuous periods in Ukrainian history. That's where we'll pick up next time. All right, so we're back. Picking up where we left off, right, with that rise of Ukrainian nationalism kind of bumping up against, well, Russia's attempts to just completely absorb them.
And heading into the 20th century, things are, well, they're about to get even more complicated.
Oh, yeah. The 20th century, talk about a roller coaster for, well, for everyone, but especially Ukraine. Revolutions, wars, political upheaval, you name it, they were right in the thick of it.
And it all starts with that 1917 Russian Revolution, right? Throws everything into chaos.
Absolutely. I mean, the Tsar overthrown, Romanov dynasty collapses. Total upheaval politically and socially, just everything's changing. And for Ukraine, this creates, well, a window, even if it's brief, a chance to go for independence.
And they did declare independence, right? 1918, if I remember correctly. Seemed like a moment of hope after, well, centuries under foreign rule.
Yeah, 1918, Ukraine declares independence, finally. It was a bold move, culmination of all those years of nationalist struggle. But sadly, yeah, incredibly short-lived.
The article mentions they actually tried twice during this period. What happened? Why couldn't they make it stick?
Well, a few reasons. One, there were deep divisions within Ukraine itself, different factions, different visions for the future of the nation. That lack of unity, well, it made it really hard to present a united front, when you've got all these external pressures.
So internal divisions played a part. But I'm guessing it wasn't just that, right? External forces probably had something to do with it too.
Absolutely. Think about it. Newly independent Ukraine, surrounded by all these powerful neighbors, Germany, Austria, Poland, they all wanted a piece of Ukrainian territory, especially with all the instability after the revolution.
So caught between a rock and a hard place. This combination of internal struggles, external pressure, it's ultimately what doomed these early attempts at independence. A heartbreaking cycle.
It is. And tragically, that pattern continues as Ukraine ends up forced into the Soviet Union in 1922. And that kicks off a whole other long and, frankly, often brutal chapter under Soviet rule.
Speaking of brutal, I have to ask about the Holodomor, this man-made famine orchestrated by Stalin in the 1930s. Millions of Ukrainian deaths. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, the Holodomor, meaning to kill by starvation, it was a deliberate act, a genocide aimed at crushing any Ukrainian resistance to Soviet collectivization, wiping out any sense of, well, Ukrainian nationalism.
So Stalin was intentionally starving Ukrainians into submission.
Basically, yes. His regime took grain, food supplies, anything they could get their hands on from Ukrainian peasants, these impossible quotas. And if you couldn't meet them, well, you were labeled an enemy of the state. Widespread starvation, death on just a massive scale, a truly chilling example of how, a totalitarian regime uses food as a weapon to control people.
It's just horrifying, the suffering they endured. And for what? Just for being Ukrainian. That must have left a mark, right, on their identity, their relationship with Russia.
Absolutely. The Holodomor becomes this defining moment in Ukrainian history. It's a symbol of Soviet brutality, but also, well, the resilience of the Ukrainian people. That deep-seated distrust of Russia, it starts there, and honestly, it continues to this day. The memory of the Holodomor, it's a powerful reminder of the human cost of these regimes and why fighting for freedom and self-determination matters.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of what can happen when power is concentrated in the hands of just a few. And as if the Holodomor wasn't enough, then comes World War II. More devastation for Ukraine.
It's true. Ukraine becomes this battleground, right, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. They're caught in the crossfire, facing occupation, violence, just more attempts to erase their identity. World War II's impact on Ukraine is, well, it's multifaceted and deeply tragic.
The article mentions Stalin's deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944. A whole population forced out of their homeland. The injustice is just mind-boggling.
Absolutely, a horrific act of ethnic cleansing. Stalin accuses them of collaborating with the Nazis, uses that as an excuse to expel them from Crimea, their ancestral home. Forced relocation to Central Asia, many died on the journey or in exile. Another tragic example of the cost of war, and what happens when political power goes unchecked.
So we've got the Holodomor, World War II, the deportation of Crimean Tatars, one tragedy after another. Was there any respite at all for Ukraine during this Soviet era?
Sadly, even during times of relative peace, Ukraine was under tight Soviet control. Culture, language suppressed, economy centrally planned, any dissent crushed. But there were a few events, seemingly small at the time, that would have huge consequences later on.
You're talking about Khrushchev's transfer of Crimea to Ukraine in 1954, right?
Yeah.
The article mentioned it seemed like this minor bureaucratic move at the time.
Exactly. Portrayed as this gesture, commemorating the 300th anniversary of the Cossack alliance with Russia. But that transfer made within the Soviet Union, well, Russia later used it to justify their annexation of Crimea in 2014. It shows how these seemingly small events can have such far-reaching and unpredictable consequences.
Wow, it's like planting a seed that grows into this major geopolitical crisis decades later. Talk about unintended consequences. Any other events during this time that kind of foreshadow these future conflicts?
For sure. Chernobyl in 1986, that was a watershed moment. This huge nuclear accident, flaws in the design, the culture of secrecy, it all exposed the cracks in the Soviet system.
Chernobyl, yeah, that was global. I remember learning about it as a kid. Those images of Pripyat just haunting. What was the impact specifically on Ukraine?
Oh, profound. Environmentally, health-wise, just devastating. Contaminated land, millions exposed to radiation. But it went beyond the physical. It eroded trust in the government, fueled anti-nuclear sentiment, and it really added to that growing desire for change, for self-determination.
Chernobyl becomes a symbol of Soviet incompetence, further fueling that desire for independence. And finally, in 1991, that moment arrives. The Soviet Union collapses, and Ukraine declares its independence again.
Yeah, what a moment. Jubilation, hope, decades of struggle, and they were finally free to chart their own course as a sovereign nation. But as we'll see, this newfound freedom, it came with its own set of challenges.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive on Ukrainian history. We've covered a lot of ground, centuries of conflict, from those Viking kingdoms to, Soviet rule. And finally, Ukraine gets its independence, hard-won independence, in 1991. But I imagine declaring independence is one thing, actually building a stable and prosperous nation, that's a whole other challenge, right?
Oh, absolutely. Ukraine, coming out of the Soviet era, they were facing a mountain of challenges. Economy in shambles, infrastructure outdated, and of course, dealing with the aftermath of Chernobyl. And on top of all that, trying to create a new political system, figure out their place in the world. Daunting.
It's a lot to take on. What were some of those first big hurdles they had to overcome?
Well, right off the bat, there's the question of nuclear weapons.
Oh, right.
Ukraine inherits this massive nuclear arsenal from the Soviet Union, third largest in the world at that time. Imagine that weight, Do they hold on to these weapons, use them as a deterrent? Or do they give them up for security guarantees?
Yeah, it's a tough call. On the one hand, nukes, they offer a sense of security, especially for a nation with a history like Ukraine's. But on the other hand, they're incredibly dangerous, expensive to maintain. What do they decide to do?
So in 1994, Ukraine makes this huge decision. They decide to completely denuclearize. They dismantle their entire arsenal, transfer the warheads to Russia for destruction. And in exchange, they get security assurances from Russia, the United States, the UK. It's all under what's called the Budapest Memorandum. A bold move, really showed their commitment to global peace.
Yeah, both inspiring and kind of heartbreaking, knowing that those security assurances, they wouldn't hold up in the end.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ukraine in the 90s, what were their main goals? What were they trying to achieve as this newly independent nation?
Their focus was on building a democracy, creating a market economy. They held free and fair elections, put a new constitution in place, and started that tough transition from, that Soviet-style, centrally planned economy to something more open, market-driven. Hope and uncertainty, I'd say, kind of marked that period.
What about their relationship with Russia? Did all that historical baggage, the tensions we talked about, did that continue to play a role?
Absolutely. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia, it remained complicated. Strong economic ties, sure, but disagreements over things like energy prices, the status of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea, and, the Russian-speaking populations in eastern Ukraine, always this underlying tension.
So the seeds of future conflict, they're already there, even as Ukraine is trying to build itself up as an independent nation.
Mm-hmm.
Anything specific during this period that's signaled this growing rift?
Well, the 2004 Orange Revolution was a big one.
Mm-hmm.
Protests, political upheaval, all because of a disputed presidential election. Many thought it was rigged to favor, a pro-Russian candidate.
Oh, yeah, I remember those images. Thousands of Ukrainians out in the streets demanding fair elections, democratic reforms. Felt like a turning point.
It was. It showed how committed Ukrainians were to democracy, how willing they were to stand up for their rights. And it really highlighted that divide, between those who wanted closer ties with Russia and those who wanted closer integration with Europe.
That East versus West dynamic already in play.
Yeah.
And did that tension just keep escalating in the years leading up to 2014 to the annexation of Crimea?
Sadly, yes. In 2013, the president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, he leaned towards Russia, and he just abruptly abandons this agreement that would have strengthened ties with the EU. And that triggered a whole new wave of protests, the Euromaidan protests.
Those were even bigger, more intense than the Orange Revolution. They went on for months, and there were violent clashes, protesters against government forces. What were they demanding, these Euromaidan protesters?
They wanted an end to corruption, accountability from the government, and a return to that path of European integration. They saw Yanukovych's move to align with Russia as a betrayal.
And these protests, they ultimately led to his ouster, right, in February 2014. But that's when things really went off the rails.
Yeah, Yanukovych flees Ukraine, and it creates this power vacuum. And Russia, they took advantage, moved right in. Within weeks, Russian troops, no insignias, they seize control of Crimea. And then this hastily organized referendum happens, widely condemned as illegitimate, and boom, Crimea is annexed by Russia in March 2014.
So Russia saw an opportunity, a chance to take back Crimea, a place with deep historical significance for them, and of course, strategically important on the Black Sea. But the annexation of Crimea, that wasn't the end of it, was it?
No, unfortunately not. Russia starts supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region, areas with lots of Russian speakers. They provided weapons, funding, military training, the whole 9 yards. And that conflict in Donbas, it escalates into a full-blown war, thousands of casualties.
So from 2014 to 2022, Ukraine is dealing with the annexation of Crimea and this war in the east. Must have had a huge impact on the country, I imagine. Did this affect Ukraine's domestic politics at all?
Oh, definitely. The conflict with Russia, it really solidified Ukrainian national identity, strengthened their resolve to resist. There's this surge of patriotism, and a renewed focus on building up their military, getting closer to the West.
And then in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky is elected president. He's comedian, no prior political experience.
Right.
What did his election signal for Ukraine?
Zelensky's win, it was a landslide. It showed that Ukrainians wanted change, real change. They were tired of the old guard, the corruption, the seemingly endless conflict. And Zelensky, he campaigned on peace, unity, reform. He promised to end the war in Donbas, tackle that endemic corruption that had plagued Ukraine for so long.
And then just a few years into his presidency, February 2022, Russia launches this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It shocked the world. I mean, Europe's biggest security crisis since World War II.
It was a culmination, really, of years of these escalating tensions. But it was a massive escalation on Russia's part. Shattered the peace in Europe, showed the world, really, what Putin's regime was capable of. The international community condemned it, sanctions were imposed, military aid and humanitarian aid poured into Ukraine.
It's a conflict that, that's still unfolding as we speak. Looking back at all this, is there a common thread, something that helps us understand why Ukraine has been at the center of so much conflict?
I think there are a few things. Firstly, geography, right? Ukraine is right there between Europe and Russia. It's a strategic location that empires throughout history have wanted to control. Then there's the resources. Fertile land, minerals, access to the Black Sea, all valuable. And finally, you have the question of identity. Ukrainians have their own culture, language, history, and that desire for self-determination, it's constantly bumping up against Russia's desire to control them.
So it's this mix of geography, resources, and identity that's shaped Ukraine's history, this turbulent history. As we wrap up this deep dive, what can we take away from Ukraine's story?
Well, I think it's a testament to human resilience. Ukrainians, they've faced it all: invasions, famine, political oppression. But they never give up hope. They fought for their freedom, their identity, their right to choose their own future. It's a reminder that peace, democracy, those things are never guaranteed. They require constant work, vigilance, courage, and being willing to stand up for what's right.
And as we move forward, it's so important that we learn from history, that we understand how complicated international relations can be, and that we support those who are fighting for freedom and self-determination wherever they are.
Well said. Ukraine's story reminds us that our choices, our actions, the values we choose to uphold, they matter not just for our own lives, but for the course of history.